Good afternoon and welcome to the museum. It's such a thrill to have all of you here today, and look at this crowd at lunchtime. This is unbelievable. Thanks for spending a little bit of your afternoon with us today. My name's John Holler and I'm the CEO, and I'm so proud to welcome you here today on behalf of our trustees and our staff, our members. Many of you are members, and of course our incredible volunteers. If you're not a member, today's the day. So after you hear this incredible lecture by Mike Malone and moderated by Scott Budman, please do go downstairs and join. There are a lot of important reasons for you to do that, and I think you'll have a lot of fun with it. I'll give you three numbers actually, 30, 20, and 3. 30 is the number of years, more than 30 years, that Mike Malone has been covering Silicon Valley. 20, more than 20 now, is the number of books Michael has written about the history of Silicon Valley. And I haven't read them all, but I would have to say there could be no better book about the history of Silicon Valley than 3, the Intel Trinity. It's an absolutely fantastic copy. I was lucky enough to get an advanced copy about, a terrific book rather. I was lucky enough to get an advanced copy about a month ago. I absolutely devoured it. And I learned that it's really about 4 books in one. First of all, if you don't know the biographies of Bob Noyce and Gordon Moore and Andy Grove, they're here, and they're here in an absolutely compelling form. Second, of course, it's the story about the birth of Intel, which is a fascinating story in and of itself. It's the story of the growth and the technical history of the company, so you're going to find out a lot of fascinating stories about how things happened within Intel, and so many landmark breakthroughs happened. And finally, and this is the part that I think is the best, it's a very observant description of the impact that these 3 men and this company have had on the world. And I think that story about the impact of all of their thinking and their work at large is perhaps the best part of the book for me. You may know Intel very well, and you might think there's nothing new to say about Intel. You'd be wrong about that. Mike has some incredible new things that he uncovers in the book, and it's an absolutely rip-roaring read. And my favorite part is the first chapter, and maybe Mike will tell you why my favorite part would be the first chapter in just a minute. To take us through this really wonderful story is NBC4's Scott Budman. Scott has been covering Silicon Valley for 19 years. He's probably the dean of broadcast reporters covering the Valley and the industry. We could think of nobody better to conduct this interview than Scott Budman. So please join me in welcoming Mike and Scott.
I'd heard there was a new book coming out. Tried it. They kind of need to read.
I think I'm actually selling more Kindle copies than hardcover.
I was going to say, I was going to ask you to autograph this afterwards.
Yeah, there you go.
It got some questions lined up, but I do remember it was in this very room not long ago. You and I were talking about Intel for the documentary.
The PBS.
The PBS
American
documentary,
yeah.
And as you and I were talking and watching, you pointed out there was Arthur Rock standing right next to
Gordon Moore
having a conversation. And I remember taking a shaky, horrible iPhone photo of that historic moment, but that had to be something of an inspiration to see those guys together.
Yeah, and perhaps the last time. I mean, there was a sense that history was turning that night. I should say, you know, you and I could literally swap seats here. Because I'm the guy that had the interview show on PBS, and you're the guy that covers Silicon Valley every day and knows what's going on. So maybe halfway through we'll switch roles.
Okay, well, I do cover it, and obviously the emphasis, and we've had this discussion before, and sort of lamented the fact that Silicon Valley only looks ahead and so rarely looks back. But those of us that don't look back are missing something, and really missing what's going to come next. Intel, a perfect example. I mean, you have one of the early spin-offs, those are sexy now, making money for investors through a stock offering, 3 volatile people.
Yes.
Some VC money. I mean, they really laid the groundwork for what we see now.
Exactly. It really all begins there. I've gotten a lot of, the question I get most in all the interviews on the book is, how dare I suggest that Intel is the most important company in the world? And everyone says, well, you know, they haven't done that well these last 5 years, and you know, why not Facebook? It's got 1 million members, and why not Google? Because it's the access point to the internet. And what I always tell them is, if tomorrow morning the employees of Intel just decided to sleep in, that they were tired of doing Moore's Law for 50 years, that all of this would just grind to a halt. I mean, it might take 10 years, but we live in a world defined by Moore's Law. And Intel is it's the high church of Moore's Law, and they're the high priests. They're committed to the death to keep Moore's Law moving forward. And it gives us the world we live in of constant change and accelerated reality and all the things we've become accustomed to. But it's not a law, it's a contract, it's a social contract. Intel is essentially, and the other companies that are now in the biz, Samsung and Qualcomm and all the rest, they've made a commitment to keep this thing going, to drive the technology forward. They don't have to do it. And if they decide they don't want to do it anymore, all of this ends.
Is it still accurate, because it has been said before, that Intel and the semiconductors are the basis for everything that came after and everything we still see today?
Yeah, and we're so far up the food chain now. I mean, you think about it, we're doing Uber and
Right.
autonomous cars and all of those things. We're so far up, we're so many generations removed from the world of chips that we forget that it all runs from there. It all emanates from there. And the reason we have this progress is because Moore's Law flips every 24, 36 months and gives us a whole new set of opportunities and keeps us moving forward.
I want to get inside the book, but first I want to just, what struck me as the cover, there is a long-running debate, obviously, science, theology. You titled this The Trinity.
The Trinity, yes.
And okay, yeah, there are three people, but the Trinity is, there's a religious, it's not a very subtle reference.
Well, if you follow my career, no one's ever accused me of lack of hyperbole. And, it was originally going to be trilogy, and I thought, that's not enough. Because the more I thought about it, it really is kind of a biblical trinity. I mean, you got Noyce the father of Silicon Valley, You've got Gordon and his law, sort of the Holy Spirit of the electronics revolution. And then you have the difficult but ultimately successful son, Andy Grove. And there's all sorts of passions going to work in all of this. Andy's relationship with Bob is really complicated, and I'm not sure I even understand it now. In fact, I gave Andy the very last word in the book. I went over to his office in Los Altos and talked to him. And I'm not going to give you the last sentence. You guys can read it. But what Andy said, after all I knew about his history with the other two founders, what he said to me knocked me out of my chair, because it was just the opposite of what I thought, and suggesting that even Andy doesn't fully understand his relationship to Noyce. So I had to call it Trinity. Just no way around.
Yeah. The history of theology is filled with complexities.
Yep.
Maybe some paranoia.
Yeah,
Intel's
absolutely.
famous for that.
No shortage of that.
And actually, it doesn't stop with Intel. I mean, you look at the reverence during the life of and even past the life of Steve Jobs, it borders on, I would say, a following.
Oh, sure.
Not merely a respect, but a following.
Yeah, it's interesting. If you look back, there's a series of key figures in the Valley's history. And it starts with Terman at Stanford. He makes all this happen. He sets the ground. Then Packard. Mm-hmm. Packard's the first world historic figure to come out of the Valley, and he's the leader of the Valley up until the 60s. Then it's Noyce. And then Noyce acts as a father figure to Jobs. I mean, people don't really appreciate that, but Steve, Steve grew up right over here.
Right.
About 12 blocks that way. And he was kind of a lost kid. And he couldn't find a mentor worthy of him until he ran into Bob Noyce. And he instantly realized, I think, that Noyce would always be able to teach him something, no matter how successful he was. And so you look at the story of Apple, it's really Apple's patterning itself on Hewlett-Packard, but Jobs is patterning himself on Bob Noyce. And Noyce's early death really shattered Steve Jobs. I mean, people don't appreciate how much it did. It grew him up. Steve Jobs grew up twice. I mean, if you knew the early Jobs, that's a pretty obnoxious guy. I mean, Noyce's death and then Jobs' illness. Those are the two things that created the Steve Jobs of legend. And I think now Jobs' reputation, which couldn't get any higher 3 or 4 years ago, is slowly fading as this next post-millennial generation comes along. And they're looking at, they're trying to look at Mark Zuckerberg, but that isn't going to work. I think they're focusing on Elon Musk. I think Elon Musk is the next major figure in the Valley story.
But I would still put forth, and I've had this discussion with them, Aaron Levy at Box, Jack Dorsey at Square, they are still looking at what Jobs was able to do at various stages of his career and saying, this is what I want to do to get to that point.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. Talking recently to Andy, he suggested that there's something happens every once in a while in the business world where people just seem to accelerate away from everybody else, and they do something that's unimaginable, that they reset the rules of what you can accomplish. And we saw that first with, Hewlett-Packard, with the great run of the HP way from 57 to 74. Then we saw it at Intel, where Intel just takes the world with the processors, with the x86 processors, and changes everything and keeps up this amazing pace. Then Jobs gives us maybe the greatest run of innovation in history, where he produces 3 category-creating $100 billion industries, one after another, every 3 years. That's when business becomes something almost supernatural, and these guys who do it. And if you talk to them, they're all terrified. They don't even know what they're doing in the thick of it, but they keep going. And that's worthy of a story to be told, I think. These singular individuals and how they did it.
That's
Not
true.
just with the results, but just what made them who they were.
You know, one person, and you and I have talked about this, who hasn't gotten his due really is Robert Noyce.
Yes.
I mean, his name is on the building. There's a certain legendary status, but we don't know as much about him. There's an amazing story you tell in the book where he had a pilot's license, which not only scared Andy Grove, but once almost took the life of both Noyce and Steve Jobs.
Yeah, they went flying.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
That's one of those like Richie Valens moments.
Yeah, it would have been a Richie Valens moment. It would have been a Buddy Holly. It would have been the end of the digital age, at the end of a runway. Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah, that's why they don't let a lot of modern CEOs do that kind of stuff. But you know, I know that Jim Morgan and Bill Davidow and Bob Noyce used to go helicopter skiing up in the Bugaboos.
Wow.
And they finally quit the year. I think 12 people died in avalanches, fellow skiers. And I remember talking to Jim Morgan about it. You guys know Jim Morgan, chairman of Applied Materials. He said he and Davidow would go down the hill like that, and Noyce would just go straight down. And I always thought that was an allegory of Bob Noyce. You know, amazingly charismatic figure. Did anybody here know Bob Noyce? Good. Okay. There's very few people left. I was up at Intel and giving a talk in Portland, and it was their marketing people, and they were running slides of all the people there and how long they had been at Intel. And there were people that had been 2 months. The longest person who'd been there was 17 years. And I realized that basically nobody at Intel anymore ever knew Bob Noyce. They see him on the wall, you know, when you walk into the Robert Noyce building. But
perpetually young.
Yes. It's hard to explain Noyce's appeal. He's as charismatic, and I've interviewed all these people over the years, and he is maybe the most charismatic person I ever met, more than Packard, more than Steve Jobs. I mean, those guys, you felt the reality distortion zone around Steve, and you felt like, you're talking to George Washington or God when you were talking to Packard. Noyce just had this easygoing gravitas. He had this wonderfully deep baritone voice. He sang madrigals, and he was a singer, but he was also an athlete. He was a champion swimmer, and you realize he had built this gigantic company, but he had also been co-inventor of the integrated circuit. So he was like like in baseball, they talk about the 5-tool player. Noyce had done everything. And he was friendly, and he was engaging, and he was down to earth. And you could see why he had that effect on Jobs. When you sat with Bob Noyce, you wanted to hang around with Bob Noyce. You wanted to be Bob Noyce. That's a hard thing to convey in words. And there's very few videos. I mean, I did the last interview with Bob before he died for my PBS show. It got erased.
Oh.
There's one copy on videotape that's kind of snowy and scratched. at Stanford Library, but that's about it. So the visual record of Bob is slim, and his physical presence, that's impossible to convey. And the sad thing is he died too young. He died just before Silicon Valley became this world phenomenon. He died just before the dot-com bubble. He died just before Intel became the most valuable manufacturing company on earth. And he left this incredible void. I mean, we all remember, I remember driving home, I'm teaching at Santa Clara, and I was driving home when Jobs died. And you were at Apple headquarters, if I remember right. And there were also crews in front of Homestead High School.
Right.
And this sort of shock wave that went through the valley. Noyce's shock wave on his death was the same, but smaller, because the valley was smaller.
Right.
But he hit every boardroom. His death shocked every boardroom in Silicon Valley, because they were all Fair children. The valley had come out of Fairchild. He had been their boss, and everyone admired him, even his competitors. And there was just sort of this feeling that the mayor of Silicon Valley, that's what his nickname was gone, and there was now a vacuum. And that vacuum, it turns out, has never been filled. The next generation, Jobs and Ellison, those guys are just too dysfunctional to be the mayor of Silicon Valley.
But let me ask this, that one thing of the tech archetype,
Yeah.
Dating back to Albert Einstein, bad hair, socially inept,
Right.
or was it the mad Hungarian, the crazy, I'm
Andy,
angry,
pound the
paranoid,
table,
right?
yeah.
And then you had the smooth, good with women. Where does that come from in the tech world before Robert Noyce?
Well, that's what makes him such an anomaly. That's what makes him stand out so much.
It was a rare thing.
Yeah, he was a very cool guy. So we haven't had another Bob Noyce since. And, we've lost this sort of center to the valley. We've lost the idea that, remember when Queen Elizabeth came to the valley, it was just assumed David Packard would meet her, and everybody went to HP and all of them and stood with Dave Packard while he met the Queen.
Yeah.
The feeling was when the Japanese semiconductor industry attacked, the only person who could speak for the US electronics industry was Bob Noyce, which is why he pulled out of Intel and went back to Washington and was very successful. Now, when President Obama flies in, who does he meet? Who is the person that stands there and says, I represent Silicon Valley? There isn't one. There hasn't been one now for 20 years. That's the void that Bob Noyce's early death left.
That's interesting.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
How many people here worked at Intel? How many worked in the semiconductor industry? Okay. How many people have lived here 20 years? Wow, 30? Not many hands went down. 40? 50? 60? Wow. Good for you guys. Okay, reason I want to get a sense of, I noticed there's not a lot of Twitter people here. This is, and that's a statement on the fact that, the Valley doesn't think about history. We look forward. I think about when I walk in this building, because 50 years ago, I was standing right about here with a pellet gun on my shoulder, out hunting birds, because this was it was one continuous field all the way to the 40 by 80 wind tunnel over here.
And you had to feed your family.
Yeah, sure. And Fairchild was right there on Ellis Street, and Mauna Loma School in Mountain View was just over there, and that's where I was going to school, and that's where Steve Jobs, he was a year behind me at Mauna Loma. And everything north of here there was a drive-in theater and nothing, okay? 20 years ago, I was right in this building, and it was Silicon Graphics. And remember, this was going to be their exciting new building. And I came here as a reporter for Fortune, and to do a story on this huge ongoing success of SGI. And the more I talked to people, the more I realized this was a company in serious trouble. And I wrote the very first negative piece about Silicon Graphics. Caused a huge stir. Luckily, history proved me correct. If we were still at the SGI global headquarters, I'd have some apologizing to do. And then we were here a year and a half ago, for the celebration for the PBS documentary on Bob Noyce and Fairchild, the rehabilitation of Bob Noyce. I think it's interesting that Noyce is coming back in the public eye. There's a curiosity about him. Gordon endures forever. Gordon's immortal because his name's on the law.
Right.
That's what counts, and I have no doubt that school kids in 500 years from now are going to be learning about Moore's law. Just because this is an amazing historic interval we're in. We're so lucky to be right here, right now. What I find interesting is Andy, who bestrode the world like a colossus 10 years ago, and a man I think is the greatest CEO of the second half of the 20th century, because he had to ride the tiger, and he did it. And look how difficult it is for everybody else to do what he managed to do. Andy's in this sort of period now of semi-eclipse. You don't hear about only the paranoid survive. I think this is Andy's time, and I think he'll come back in the public eye, a few years from now.
Well, it'll be interesting to see. I think there is a little nostalgia for a smooth CEO, a good-looking CEO,
An adult CEO.
An adult CEO. And the young CEOs now will say, now Bob Noyce, there was a guy who could get the message across and, by the way, invent an entire industry.
Right.
And so I think that there is a little bit of that now, if you look at the Jack Dorseys of the world, saying, I don't have to be crazy pulling my hair out. I can be smooth and be on magazine covers and still lead a company to a
I can take off the hoodie and put on a shirt.
Well, yeah.
I'm actually in the New Yorker today, which is like the greatest thrill of my writing career.
Absolutely.
Just to see that font, just gave me shivers. Annals of technology. It's a Q&A. But I ended it by saying, there's a distinct difference between that old crowd and the current crop. And that is, if you go back and look at the founders of the semiconductor industry, so the founders of the modern Silicon Valley, they're all sons of the working class, they'd seen tough times. Noyce was the son of a preacher in Iowa, itinerant preacher. Apparently he didn't give very good sermons, so he got moved around. Gordon Moore's dad was the sheriff in Half Moon Bay, arresting bootleggers. In fact, Gordon is of that first generation. He's the only local. He's the only true Silicon Valley native. I mean, even Bill Hewlett, whose dad was the dean of the medical program at Stanford, lived in San Francisco, and his dad died young. So Hewlett, with his terrible dyslexia, actually was kind of a mercy acceptance at Stanford. Andy obviously went through hell. Sure. I mean, he went through World War II, and if you know anything about Budapest, I mean, it was run over twice. The German army in retreat, then the Red Army, just horrible. And he managed to escape in the mid-1950s, literally over the wire, and got here. So, and the rest of the founders of the semiconductor industry in the Valley, they all really came from working class stock. They understood what it was like to, live from paycheck to paycheck and lose parents young and all of those things. And that gave them a sense of reality, a sense of, this is what life is like, for my employees and for my customers that I don't see now in the current generation living in San Francisco.
I mean, you could argue simply to say that whatever the ethic was, the Intel employees did well. They were able to feed their families, start companies on their own. We're seeing that at Facebook. We saw that at Google. We're seeing that at Twitter. Now that they have been enriched, if you will, by success,
right? They
are now sort of spreading out as Fairchild did.
Yeah, but Ted Hoff lived 4 houses away from me when he was inventing the microprocessor, and Bob almost drove me over about 8 times racing down Fremont Avenue. I mean, I would run into Dave Packard buying nails at Orchard Supply in Palo Alto. This crowd, they're much more children of profession. They're like software engineers who are the children of software engineers, and there's kind of this oligarch, entitled attitude that I see in them, which we're beginning to see the backlash to in San Francisco, the stoning of the buses and the attitude, that these people, the hipsters, are overrunning the town, that I didn't see that in the old guard. Another factor, of course, is these guys were hardware. In fact, as everybody out here from the semiconductor industry knows, it's not even electronics. It's a chemical industry. It's fabrication. It's real hands-on stuff.
Right.
And the social networking world, the Web 2.0 stuff, that's software. That's code. And code is a little more ethereal and detached from reality than most businesses.
Now, hardware has lasted. We've talked about that. It's still the basis of everything we do. Are we a generation that is now ephemeral, or will this last, and will the children of the current oligarchs start their own companies, whether they be software or hardware or whatever?
Oh, I think the change has already begun. I think the software era is ending. It's dominated Silicon Valley now for about 15 years. And it moved the center of gravity. If you remember, center of gravity of Silicon Valley started in Palo Alto, up in the Apollonian elegant hills of Stanford Industrial Park, then went down to the dirty Dionysian world of the valley floor at California Street and San Antonio Road, where Shockley and Fairchild were.
Right.
Right down there. So Mountain View, and then headed south through the Lockheed Industrial Park, down into the Golden Triangle in San Jose, spread around the bay, but it was consistently heading south. And then with the arrival of the internet, it hopped north to San Francisco, and it's been residing, the capital of Silicon Valley has been San Francisco now since about 1998. Okay, there's a lot of mass down here, but that's where all the action's been. But I'm beginning to notice some interesting changes, and those of you, I'm sure most of you live pretty close to here, you've probably noticed the changes too. Most obviously in the fact they put up those house for sale signs in your neighborhood, and the house sells 14 hours later for $1.6 million. The one that, my parents bought an Eichler in Sunnyvale. My parents had a house in Mountain View they bought for $19,500, 1963. Then they bought an Eichler in Sunnyvale for $26,000. The house in Sunnyvale, the last I looked, it was worth $1.5 million, and it's gone up 20% since the beginning of the year. I live in the oldest house in the South Bay, and it's in a neighborhood just off Bernardo in Sunnyvale. And the houses in my neighborhood, they do not sell. They don't take any longer than 2 days to sell, and they're selling at 20 to 30% over market price. That's a clue that something is afoot. And what I'm beginning to notice is the valley is getting ready to make another move of its capital, and I think this is ground zero right here. I really think that the next decade, maybe even 20 years of the valley's future, is back right here at the kind of the triangle of Mountain View, Sunnyvale, Cupertino. And why do I say that? For two reasons. Well, three. One of them is San Francisco is becoming inhospitable. They're doing all sorts of things to drive tech companies out. They're going to basically poison their own well. You're seeing a backlash up there against this new crowd of rich young people. Also, San Francisco doesn't like children. San Francisco likes dogs, And so
they've long had a school problem.
Yeah,
a public school.
And it's not getting any better. San Francisco stopped being a working town in about 1965. Okay, it's been a tourist town. Now it's a tech town. But these 23-year-olds who come and go work for Twitter and the rest, they're now 30. They're getting married. They're having kids, and they've got to be looking around and saying, I don't know if this is the right place to raise my kids.
Right.
Which suggests they're going to go south. I think they're actually going to go east, interestingly, but we'll get to that in a second. If you look around here, Facebook is down here.
Right.
Google is shifting ever closer this way into this 237-17-101 triangle. I was in downtown Sunnyvale the other day, and I'm in the old neighborhoods, and I look up, and there's like a 1 million square foot office building right plunked in the middle of downtown Sunnyvale, and I drive by the sign, LinkedIn, okay? And obviously, all of us drive up 280, the Apple Donut's coming, By the way, there's a thing called Malone's, there's like 4 Malone's laws. And the first law is whenever a company builds a new global headquarters short the stock. Yeah, it works. It's always worked. And the reason it works is because whenever you move into the fancy new building, you're more concerned about where your office is and whether you get a good window and where your parking space is, as opposed to like shipping product. And so...
So do we have to wait to short Apple stock until they move in?
Well, yeah. Apple, well, you want to get into Apple? We can talk about Apple for a moment. When Steve Jobs died, I wrote his obituary in the Wall Street Journal. And I sort of made a prediction. I said, Tim Cook's going to be a terrific CEO because he's the guy that always made the trains run on time at Apple. And he knew how to handle Steve. Because Steve was like this radical element that if you could control him, he gave you magic. But if you unleashed him, he would just destroy the company's morale and everything else. And just sow chaos, which is what he did the first time. Cook did a brilliant job of that. So what I predicted was Apple would become more profitable and more successful for the first few years after Steve's death. But what Apple had lost was the guy who, when you came in with a new idea, looked at you and said, that's not crazy enough. That's not a big enough risk. Steve Jobs created, unique maybe in the history of American business, a corporate culture of a giant company that was pro-risk as opposed to risk-averse. You got punished for not being enough of a risk-taker under Steve Jobs.
The pirate flag.
Yeah.
Famous.
And so Cook is not that guy. And so what we're seeing, I think, and I think it's beginning to play out, sadly, is that Apple is upgrading and advancing their existing products really, really well. And they'll continue to do that, and their profit margins will get higher, and their stock will keep climbing because of those things. But are we going to see, iPod, iPhone, iPad in the course of 8 years ever again from that company? I don't think so. So I think the age of Apple as the most exciting company on the planet is probably done.
It's interesting because it was exciting for the same reason that what Intel was doing and the products it was creating were exciting, and those were all hardware. Can a software company be the most exciting company in the world? Because Oracle was never...
No.
I tried to do stories on Oracle, and you can't use the word, back-end customer relation management software in a newscast.
Exactly.
So you had to talk about the crazy CEO and the fact that it was minting millionaires. Well, same with Cisco, but a hardware company...
See, that's why I think you're going to have fun reporting the next few years, because I really think we're shifting back from a software era to a hardware era. And it's simultaneous with this move down south. We build stuff down here. Right. They code stuff up there. And if you look at Tesla, you look at all the wearables that are being created, and we're going to see hundreds of thousands of products in the next decade of embedded technology. If you just look at healthcare and medical monitoring, mobile medical monitoring, it's all going to move to the watch. It's going to be testing your galvanic skin response, your blood pressure. It's all going to happen.
Yeah, I can tell you how long I slept last night.
Yeah, exactly. And they're even looking at things like measuring your gait and the way you walk as an early indicator of Parkinson's. It may be the very first indicator. Because of Moore's law, that's going to get smaller and smaller. The sensor revolution is the least celebrated revolution in digital analog in the last 30 years. That's exploding too. That's giving us big data because we're going to be, the age of testing samples is over. Now we test everything. We measure everything. We're going to measure every gust of air. We're going to measure every fish in the sea because the sensor, once these things become almost microscopic, you just throw them into the air and they float around for a generation in the atmosphere. And then they're sending signals. We're developing all these analytics. So we've literally ended a historic era that lasted about 500 years of statistics. Right. And now we just go to measuring everything. All hardware. We're going to stick stuff under our skin. We're going to swallow smart pills to measure our vital signs. We're going to do all these things, and these are hardware products. Yeah, they're going to have software, they're going to have code, but the heart of it's going to be physical things. And when it comes down to physical things, here.
Well, Microsoft became the biggest software company in the world and the biggest company in the world on the back of Intel chips and the machines that they powered. Thank you. Would you like to take some audience questions.
Yeah, sure. Anything else you want to ask?
These are going to be far more intelligent than anything I have on this tablet, I guarantee. So why don't we, let's see. How would you compare Intel's history and impact with more modern companies like Facebook and Google? Is the era of great component companies over? So sort of along the lines of what...
Okay. No, the era of components isn't over because we constantly regenerate them every 2 or 3 years. We have to keep doing that. Luckily, if you look at the announcements coming out of IBM and Intel and some university laboratories over the last 5 years, I've made 2 great mistakes as a reporter in my career. The first one was declaring Silicon Valley dead about 4 times.
You're not the only one, everyone.
Basically, every time I got stuck in traffic and got pissed off, I went home and wrote an op-ed for the Mercury News that the Valley was unlivable and it wouldn't last much longer. I stopped doing that.
So maybe Uber will keep us journalists happy.
Yes, yeah.
We won't have to drive and Silicon Valley will live on.
Exactly. And then the second mistake I made as a reporter consistently was suggesting that Moore's Law might end soon. And all credit to the semiconductor industry. They have done one miracle after another. I mean, they should have hit a physical wall 20 years ago. And they just keep getting smaller and smaller features. Now we're looking at 3D gates and transistors. IBM just announced a new type of circuitry that's going to enable them to get down to 7 nanometers. We're leaving silicon, and we're heading towards there was a 3 and 5 column on the periodic table, so we have metal insulators now. Every time you just think they can't keep going, that is physics, the laws of physics are going to get in the way, they pull another rabbit out of their hat.
Well, it's interesting because it is becoming more and more important, and people are starting to, for a few years, I think chips had become commoditized. People were sort of ignoring it. But as many of you in the audience know, firsthand, Intel stock the other day hit its highest level in 12 years. So that's Wall Street coming around and saying, oh yeah, this is really important to everything else that's going around out there.
Yeah, it's also because Intel really screwed up about 5 years ago.
Well, there was... You know.
They zigged when they should have zagged. Yeah. And it's easy to say they just made they made a dumb decision. But the whole point of being Intel is you take big, risky decisions. And the genius of Intel is not the fact that they don't make mistakes. In fact, I gave a speech at Intel a few months ago where I said, I've now concluded Intel has made more mistakes than any company in history. But Intel's ability to recover from mistakes, that is their genius. And that was Andy Grove's genius. Every time Intel was on the canvas, Andy would pick them up and kick them in the butt and keep them moving.
This building is full of companies that made one mistake and
yeah,
that was pretty
there's
much
only companies that don't make mistakes come in 2 forms: startups that make just one mistake, right. And old mature companies that are risk averse and try to never make mistakes, and they just become obsolete. Intel keeps taking big risks. One of the big risks was Craig Barrett took the company towards networking. He committed the company with all their acquisitions, everything else, towards networking, and the world went the other direction into mobile. And Intel got left behind and has been racing to catch up. And I think the financials last week told Wall Street, we've caught up. We're now being designed into an awful lot of smartphones and tablets and all of that. So Intel looks like they're back in the game, at least for now.
All right.
Do we answer that question?
Well, I do want to bring in the Facebook and Google. I mean, the impact that Intel had is legendary. Will these, because maybe give them a little more time, will the younger upstarts, if you can call Google an upstart, will they have the impact that Intel has had?
Google's had an enormous impact. Google essentially, everyone thinks of Google as a search engine, but what it really was a stealth marketing effort to steal all the advertising away from the media.
Right.
Which it did brilliantly. You know, every time the New York Times or Fortune or Vanity Fair put a Google search box on their homepage, they gave away their advertising to Google. So Google's impact has been enormous. Facebook, boy, I'm just of 2 minds. On one hand, 1 billion users, which makes it, you know, the most impactful company, a service company, in theory, of all time. I mean, it ranks with like Coca-Cola. 1 billion users, but what keeps them there?
Well, I would argue that a computer user, Apple is different because now in the mobile world we carry them around with us.
Right.
A Microsoft user of years past used his or her product when they were at their desk.
Right.
The Facebook user has that with them and has built a pretty darn big chunk of their life with that they take with them everywhere.
Yes.
That's very impactful.
Yes, but I look at the example of MySpace where it looked like it was going to rule the world.
Right.
And it made some bad business decisions. One of them was not protecting its users from predators. And the other one was trying to monetize them too hard. And everybody just one morning left. And I keep looking at Facebook and thinking, this is a company that keeps pushing the envelope on trying to make money off of its users. And it's perfectly willing, as it's shown, to take your private information and sell it to the world. And and this, by the way, is another reminder why you want people with gray hair in the company to tell you, no, you really don't want to share people's purchasing information with their friends.
Right.
Because do you really want to share the fact you bought Preparation H or you bought, your wife sees that you bought flowers and not for her. I mean, there was all of this is what happened with and they keep trying to do this. The thing about Facebook is I don't trust them because I've never believed they have my best interest at heart.
Here's the devil's advocate to that. And I'll speak for those who don't yet have gray hair, because there are those. I'm not talking about us. That private information is willingly given up.
Oh yes, there's a much different relationship between millennials and even the younger people,
right? And
like our kids,
right,
towards privacy. But nevertheless, Facebook is playing a very dangerous game, and if they make a mistake, people will walk. There's not that much holding people there. They've poured a lot of stuff in there, but once again, that's ephemera.
Right, and we're talking about people who are, by definition, short attention spans.
Short attention, yeah. But let me throw in one thing. I think Zuckerberg's strategy has been brilliant. I think he knows the vulnerability of Facebook. So what does he do? He goes out when Facebook is beginning to fade. When your grandma has a Facebook page and you're 16 years old, okay. So they go out and buy Instagram, spend a ton of dough for it, but they've migrated hundreds of millions of people to Instagram.
Oh, yeah.
So Instagram is no longer the flavor of the day. What do they go out and buy next? WhatsApp. $19 billion, 55 employees.
Yeah.
I heard that every vested employee at WhatsApp will make minimum $52 million, often for less than a year's work. Yeah. And why would Mark spend that kind of money? My vision of his business model is there's this roaring river, the zeitgeist, the technology revolution, and he is jumping from rock to rock as Facebook begins to fade Instagram to WhatsApp, and he's got the money. If there's one thing,
I was going to say, when he takes a bottled water size thing and dips it in that flowing river, he comes up with $19 billion.
Yes, he does.
So it's not a bad river.
I mean, you think about it.
Should all paddle down that river.
I mean, every company around here is like Scrooge McDuck. They got vaults filled with gold coins. I mean, I figured out the other day that Apple has enough cash on hand, they could just buy every new startup for the next generation. I mean, they're sitting on more money than the GNP of most of the companies in the world, and Facebook and all that. So why develop it inside? Why compete with some new company that's coming at you head on? Just go sideways and buy the next new thing and keep moving.
Years ago, in an interview, Carol Bartz, when she was still running Autodesk, told me that that's the beauty of being a big company with a lot of cash, is the rest of the tech world is a farm team, and you're the major leagues, and it's worked out pretty well.
Not
Intel...
for Carol, though, unfortunately.
Well, no, but I mean, she did well.
I miss her. I thought she was the most fun person in Silicon Valley.
I agree.
I'm
a little disappointed you haven't dropped any F-bombs during this interview.
I think she used them all.
Yeah.
No, we reporters, we regularly voted her the CEO you want to go out drinking with.
Yes.
Yeah, I love Carol.
Could Intel have happened anywhere else besides Silicon Valley?
Ooh, that's a tough one. Well, we know it tried to start, succeeded to some degree in Texas and at TI and Motorola.
Right.
But this explosion of hundreds of companies all pursuing the same goal in doing that with the venture capital sitting available, with the talent floating around. Boy, it's hard to imagine. I can't even imagine Fairchild anywhere else. I mean, the stories about Fairchild are just mind-boggling. And it occurred 4 blocks from here.
Right.
But I mean, Marshall Cox told me that when he was hired, he came out of LA, he had no idea, he was for sales, he had no idea, he would end up being VP of sales. He had no idea what Fairchild really made. And he got here, and it was a half-finished wooden building. The upper floor was empty, and they had sawhorses with boards on them, plywood boards, and some folding chairs, and they did a slideshow, and they were showing a transistor. And Marshall he was going to have the entire southwest region of Fairchild. And he looked at the slide, and he didn't know if that transistor, which is like 12 feet across, was life-size or tiny. And he said, I remember sitting there going, I got to get a station wagon. Because how am I going to carry samples around? And then they broke for break. And he walked over to the sawhorses with the plywood on them, and all they had put out were plates of brownies and bottles of scotch. And that was the morning break at Fairchild. Yeah. And you think
That's
about
the startup I want to work at.
maybe $1 trillion worth of business came out of Fairchild, the Fair children blowing up and all the companies it created and proliferating. I can't imagine that kind of aggregation of talent at that time anywhere but here. Certainly not on the East Coast. It had to be here.
And they're still trying.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, Bloomberg had a big thing in New York to try to seed fund startups.
Oh, yeah.
We still see it out of the Triangle in North Carolina, Texas, Boston. Everyone's still trying to be Silicon Valley.
I'm proposing my next piece for the Wall Street Journal is going to be titled, "The Next Silicon Valley is ... Silicon Valley." And that's because we still have 40% of the venture capital.
Right.
With the return to hardware, things are shifting back down here again, but the valley's spilling east. It's already over there in Livermore in the 680 corridor. It's moving on into San Joaquin County. Go visit Tracy. I mean, Tracy used to be where you stopped to get late breakfast on your way to Tahoe. After a 4-hour drive from San Jose. Now you get there, now you just blast over the Altamont Pass, which is 8 lanes, and they have Amazon over there now.
Right.
I mean, the valley's going to keep growing because as long as the transportation's efficient enough, the valley's going to keep growing because this is the only place on Earth. I mean, when people say, what makes this place different? I just point over here to the Century Theaters, and I say, go over there and watch a movie, but don't worry about the movie. Watch the slides and the ads before the movie. It's all about hiring programmers in Silicon Valley. No place in the world's like that. I go to the Pete's on Homestead in Cupertino, and all those little tables, and it's not filled with, guys writing poems. It's 3 or 4 middle-aged people or people in their 20s, and they got spreadsheets on a tablet, and they're starting a company. I've never been any place on the planet where you see startup teams everywhere you go.
Well, look at the advertising when you're either at a Sharks game or anything at San Jose Arena. And
Oh, yeah.
it's all tech companies. Would people from other states, not to mention other planets, know what all these ads are for, even when they get here?
Exactly.
It is
And
fun.
it's just second nature to us.
This is interesting. Back on the book, someone wants to know, did you hit any bumps when interviewing for the Intel book? I mean, I know you've covered these guys more than anybody, so they must have been interested.
Yeah,
in what
one of the
you-
nice things about doing this book was I've covered Intel longer than anybody, I think. All the trade press guys that I started out with have all retired, and I was the first daily tech reporter in the world, so I was covering Intel on the first week, so I got a lot of interviews, and I kept them with Noyce and with Moore, and I know most of the guys who, like the team that developed the microprocessor. I see Federico Fagin once a month for lunch, so. And I wrote a book with David Al, so I mean, I'm able to talk to these guys, and I had an awful lot of stuff that would be impossible to get now. I mean, Noyce is the tough one because there's such a finite amount of stuff on him, and I was responsible for about half of that stuff, so I could draw from that too.
Someone wants to know, is it inevitable, and what happens when Moore's Law does come to an end?
With luck, I'll be dead when that happens. Yeah, thank you. I thank Gordon regularly for giving me a career. What happens? That's a good question. I mean, do we go back to status quo ante? Do we go back to 1948, where, you know, we had steady change all through the 20th century, most of it driven by the transistor, and before that, the vacuum tube, you know. So it's basically gates, you know, electromechanical, vacuum tube, transistor, integrated circuit, microprocessor. I think if Moore's Law were to stop, we would see the echo of it. I mean, it's been said that we still haven't spun out all the implications of the 8086, you know, and we're now 6 or 8 generations past that. I think the echo of Moore's Law will last half a century. But after that, if there isn't some other metronome that drives society, I think, you know, we go back to an era where we don't expect that much progress and change.
You think we'll discover something, you know, Silicon Valley, we still call it, although, you know, it's the materials.
I certainly hope so. I mean, it could be nano, it could be biological. You know, those things are all waiting in the wings. By the way, I wrote a piece. It just ran in Harvard Business Review. I think Gordon Moore did us a great disservice in 1965, because if you guys remember, when he sat down to do Moore's Law, it was an article assignment by Electronics Magazine, and he wanted to write about the progress in the performance of memory chips, the capacity of memory chips. And he only had like 6 of them to work from, and they were like 16K. You know, maybe they're just 16. I mean, it was that early, bits. And so he sat down with a sheet of regular graph paper, and he drew it, and it went like this. It went right off the top of the page, and he went, oh, damn. So he took that. We didn't say damn because Gordon doesn't swear, but he took it and threw it aside, and he got out some log graph paper, you know, regular graph and then log. And he did it again, and he marked them out, and they formed a straight line. And he went, oh, nice, shallow, you know, comfortable, easygoing line. And he said, wow, I think I see a pattern here. Let's write this up. And then they called it Moore's Law. And every year he'd go in front of SIA or something and say, well, look, it's still going on that line.
Right.
And it's still going on that line now. Well, the disservice he gave was we got used to that nice line. And we think of the rate of change of the technology revolution as fast, but, you know, something we can manage, something we can assimilate. And so I said, with the help of Tom Waldrop, who's in the audience somewhere at Intel, we reconstructed Gordon's original graph on regular paper up to the present. And now you go from 0 to 10 billion transistors, okay, and climbing. And that curve goes like this till 2005. And then it makes the big hyperbolic curve straight up. And it's like, oh, wow. And then you suddenly realize that everything that we've been through, basically from the transistor radio to mainframe computers, mini computers, personal computers, calculators, smartphones, the internet, is all in the foothills down here. And this turn going up, it just, the leaps per year, or every 2 years of Moore's Law, are staggering. And that's why you're hearing people like Ray Kurzweil, who we saw at the beginning,
right,
talking about the singularity, because he understands that slope and says if we go out there just a few more years, the machines are so powerful that we just join the machines. Does it curve off? Maybe, who knows? But for now, it's still climbing. And the rate of change is unbelievable. Everything we've gone through up till now is just a prelude to what's about to hit us.
And your book is about how we got here.
How we got here. And the people who mined it, who mined that law. Yeah.
And who started it. And thank you, Mr.
Thank you.
Malone.
Thank
Mike
you,
will be
everybody.
outside signing copies.